It began far below the surface of the Atlantic, in a steel tube packed with nuclear weapons, sweat-soaked uniforms, and men who hadn't seen sunlight in almost 3 weeks. Because in 1962, as the world balanced on the edge of annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarine B-59 drifted like a dying animal, its batteries running low, its temperature rising past anything human lungs should breathe, and its crew suffocating in stale air as American destroyers circled above like sharks unaware they were toying with Armageddon itself. Deep inside the suffocating heat of the submarine, Captain Valentin Savitsky clutched the plotting table, while depth charges thundered outside the hull, each explosion shaking loose flakes of rust and sending a wave of panic through sailors who believed the war had already begun. Because to them, these were not signaling charges, but the first blows of a nuclear conflict, and with no contact from Moscow, no fresh air, and no understanding of the American intentions, the men of B-59 believed they were the last survivors of a world that was already burning, unaware that one decision in that underwater oven would determine whether millions above lived or died, while the quiet, exhausted second-in-command, Vasili Arkhipov, remained the only barrier between the world and a nuclear launch that could have ended civilization. The crisis had spiraled long before B-59 even reached the Atlantic. Khrushchev had rushed missiles to Cuba to counter American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, hoping to rebalance the global chessboard, while Kennedy's advisors debated airstrikes and invasion plans that could ignite the world. Yet none of these political moves mattered to the men trapped underwater, who were never told they were heading into a U.S. naval quarantine zone bristling with destroyers, sonar nets, and aircraft ready to hunt anything bearing a Soviet flag. And because their Foxtrot-class submarine could not stay submerged for long without surfacing to recharge its batteries, they found themselves sinking deeper into a nightmare where surfacing meant death and staying submerged meant madness. As days turned into weeks, temperatures inside B-59 soared above 40 degrees Celsius. Sailors collapsed at their posts, uniforms soaked, instruments fogged with condensation, and the air grew thick with carbon dioxide until breathing felt like inhaling boiling metal. Food spoiled, water rationing turned cruel, and the walls dripped sweat as if the submarine itself were suffocating. The engine room became a furnace where men passed out from heat stroke, dragged away by comrades too weak to speak, and sleep became impossible as bodies stuck to floors, pipes, and machinery, while their skin blistered and their eyes burned, transforming B-59 from a war machine into a floating tomb. And then communication with Moscow died completely. Their long-range antenna could not pierce the water, and every attempt to rise closer to the surface was met with American destroyers circling above. Dropping practice depth charges meant as signals, but interpreted as proof that the war had begun, and with every explosion, fear spread through the crew that they were being hunted by an enemy who had already unleashed nuclear fire upon the world, leaving them alone as the last retaliatory weapon of the Soviet Union. Captain Savitsky eventually snapped under the pressure, dehydrated, exhausted, half delirious from carbon dioxide poisoning. He declared that if the Americans wanted war, he would give them one, that they would not die without striking back, and he reached for authorization to arm the submarine's deadliest weapon, a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, powerful enough to obliterate an entire carrier group. Because in his mind, only one conclusion existed. The war had begun, and they were already the last line of defense. The United States had a strict policy in 1962. Any nuclear explosion, anywhere, from anyone, required immediate retaliation, meaning that if that torpedo had been launched, Washington would assume Moscow ordered it, Moscow would assume Washington struck first, and missiles would fly within minutes, killing tens of millions before either side understood what had actually happened. The launch required 3 authorized signatures: Captain Savitsky, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and the second-in-command, Vasili Arkhipov. 2 said yes. Arkhipov said no. He didn't shout, panic, or collapse. He simply refused, just as he had refused to die when he survived the reactor meltdown aboard Submarine K 19 years earlier, an incident that left his crewmates with radiation burns as they died slowly while he fought to keep the vessel alive. That experience had taught him that panic kills men faster than radiation or depth charges ever will. And now, inside B-59, his calm was the only force preventing the end of the world. Arkhipov argued that there was no proof the Americans were attacking, that the charges might be warnings, that surfacing was the only rational option, and for 4 suffocating hours, in 100-degree heat, with oxygen levels falling and men hallucinating from fumes, he fought against the decision to fire the torpedo. While outside, American destroyers continued circling, completely unaware that every signaling charge they dropped was pushing the submarine closer to nuclear launch. Slowly, painfully, Arkhipov pulled Savitsky back from the edge, convincing him that surfacing was the only choice. And when the submarine finally broke through the waves, sailors stumbled onto the deck like corpses returning from the underworld, gasping for air under the blinding floodlights of U.S. ships surrounding them, helicopters buzzing overhead. Yet none of the Americans knew that minutes earlier, the world had hung on the edge of total destruction. They simply watched the battered Soviet submarine drift away, unaware that the only reason they were alive was because one exhausted Soviet officer had refused to end the world. For decades, no one knew how close humanity had come to nuclear war. The Americans believed they had merely encouraged a stranded submarine to surface, and the Soviets quietly punished the crew upon their return, calling them cowards for their failure to stay hidden. Only years later, in the late 1990s, did declassified documents and surviving officers reveal the truth, that the closest the world ever came to nuclear war was not in Cuba, Berlin, or Korea, but inside a suffocating submarine no one remembered, where one man's refusal changed the fate of mankind. For the men aboard B-59, surfacing should have brought relief, but instead it delivered humiliation, confusion, and a bitter truth they didn't yet understand. The Americans didn't know the submarine carried a nuclear torpedo, didn't know their signaling charges were interpreted as acts of war, and didn't know they had been seconds away from triggering a full-scale nuclear exchange. They simply saw a battered Soviet submarine limping upward, its sailors collapsing on deck from heat exhaustion, and assumed they had successfully pressured it into revealing itself. Floodlights cut across the waves as U.S. destroyers surrounded the submarine, their crews watching with curiosity rather than hostility, unaware that inside that steel coffin, the greatest nuclear threat of the crisis hadn't come from missiles in Cuba, but from a suffocating vessel beneath their feet. The Soviet sailors staggered into the open air, their lungs burning as they inhaled oxygen that felt almost painful after weeks of stale fumes. While American officers observed through binoculars, puzzled by the men's condition, but following strict orders not to escalate the situation, a loudspeaker crackled across the water as an American ship attempted communication, but not a single Soviet officer responded. For B-59's crew, the Americans were still the enemy, and revealing their condition would only deepen the shame they already felt. Captain Savitsky remained inside the control room, drenched in sweat, furious and humiliated that he had surfaced in front of the adversary he believed had attacked them, and his officers quietly braced themselves for the consequences they knew awaited them back in the Soviet Union. Because in the USSR, failure was often treated the same as treason. Meanwhile, Arkhipov, the man whose refusal had saved the world, stood quietly on the deck, exhausted, his uniform soaked through, yet holding himself with the same calm discipline he had shown in the depths. He knew that in Moscow, no medals were waiting for them, no speeches, no gratitude, only suspicion, interrogation, and accusations. When B-59 departed the confrontation and disappeared into the night, the Americans never realized they had just been in the presence of a nuclear torpedo, nor that they had narrowly avoided the very war they were trying to prevent. To them, the submarine incident was a minor tactical victory, proof that their signaling charges worked. To the Soviets, it was a disaster. The submarine returned to its base at Gazievo weeks later, battered, nearly inoperable, and filled with sailors who looked like they had returned from the dead. But instead of praise, the crew was met with condemnation from high command. Admiral Vitaly Fokin publicly scolded the officers, declaring that they should have sunk to the bottom like true Soviet submariners, a chilling reminder of how deeply the Soviet Navy valued obedience over survival. Sailors were interrogated, reprimanded, and threatened with disciplinary action. Not a single officer mentioned how close they had come to nuclear launch, because admitting they nearly fired a nuclear weapon without authorization was a guaranteed prison sentence. Or worse, Arkhipov received no official recognition, no commendation, nothing that acknowledged the world-changing decision he had made. He simply resumed his duties as if he had not single-handedly prevented World War III. Meanwhile, the political world above the ocean's surface continued spiraling toward war. In Washington, President Kennedy faced immense pressure from his Joint Chiefs, who demanded military action against Cuba, insisting that Soviet missiles there were an existential threat. In Moscow, Khrushchev scrambled to conceal Soviet failures and maintain the illusion of control, not knowing that one of his submarine commanders had nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. The Americans believed Khrushchev was reckless. The Soviets believed Kennedy was preparing an invasion. And throughout all of this, neither side understood the razor-thin margin that had separated diplomacy from nuclear fire. The submarine incident did not reach either leader's desk. It was buried under layers of military bureaucracy, treated as routine submarine harassment, and dismissed as irrelevant to the crisis unfolding in Cuba. Had the truth been known, both leaders would have realized they were seconds away from losing all control, because once a nuclear torpedo launched, no political leader could stop the chain reaction it would trigger. The terrifying reality was that the world had nearly ended without the leaders in Washington or Moscow ever knowing they were one decision away from annihilation. As the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its climax on October 27, 1962, a day historians now call Black Saturday, the world unknowingly stood even closer to nuclear war than anyone realized. That same day, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the American pilot, prompting Kennedy's generals to demand retaliation. Another U-2 accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace over Siberia, triggering an alert that scrambled MiG fighters and brought the United States to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached in American history, outside of an actual nuclear launch. And beneath the surface, dozens of other Soviet submarines, most of them without nuclear torpedoes, but some carrying them, were evading American destroyers, hunted across the Atlantic by an enemy who had no idea which submarines were armed with the final apocalypse. B-59 was only one of 4 Foxtrot-class submarines sent to patrol near Cuba, and at least one more, B-75, carried the same nuclear torpedoes. Any one of these submarines under similar stress and confusion could have launched their weapon. Any one of their captains, pushed to desperation by heat, fear, and miscommunication, could have made the decision Arkhipov prevented. And if that had happened, the world today would look unrecognizable, if it existed at all. In the United States, the American public remained unaware of the immediate danger. News coverage focused on missile installations in Cuba, grainy aerial photographs, and fiery speeches at the United Nations. But no one mentioned the submarine threat. The Navy had not released any information. Commanders believed the incident to be routine posturing, and the press had no idea that anything had occurred beneath the surface. Kennedy continued tense negotiations with Khrushchev, unaware that one low-ranking Soviet officer had already prevented the war he was desperately trying to avoid. In Cuba, Fidel Castro watched anxiously, convinced the United States was hours away from invasion, urging Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike if American forces entered Cuban soil. In the Pentagon, generals demanded airstrikes. In Moscow, military advisors urged Khrushchev to stand firm. And through all of this, the underwater crisis of B-59 remained hidden from everyone who believed they controlled the fate of the world. Only months after the crisis ended did Soviet intelligence officers begin piecing together reports from returning submarine crews. Internal investigations revealed the catastrophic conditions aboard the Foxtrot-class submarines, the misinterpretation of American signaling charges, and the potential for unauthorized nuclear launch. The Soviet Navy quietly adjusted procedures, increased communication protocols, and reviewed the psychological screening for submarine officers. But none of these changes addressed the fundamental truth. A single human decision had prevented nuclear war. Arkhipov remained anonymous, his heroism classified, his actions known only to a few senior officers who considered the incident so embarrassing they buried it deeper. And for decades, the world believed the Cuban Missile Crisis had been controlled, measured, and ultimately resolved through diplomacy and leadership. The myth persisted that Kennedy and Khrushchev stared each other down and blinked at the right moment. But that was only part of the story. The real story was darker, more chaotic, and far more terrifying. The world didn't come close to ending because of calculated political strategy. It came close because of human fear, human error, and a suffocating submarine commander who thought he was under attack. World War III wasn't prevented by a speech or negotiation. It was prevented by a man sweating in the darkness of a metal coffin, surrounded by dying batteries and hallucinating sailors, who refused to let panic dictate the fate of humanity. Historians now understand that the B-59 incident was not just another close call. It was the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war, closer than the Korean War, closer than the Berlin standoff, closer even than the US-Soviet standoff in the 1980s. And yet, for nearly 40 years, the story remained untold. Not until the collapse of the Soviet Union did fragments of the truth begin to emerge, pulled from declassified military records and interviews with surviving submariners. Only then did the world learn that the fate of humanity rested on a single vote, a vote cast by a man almost no one had ever heard of. Arkhipov, a name unknown in the West, uncelebrated in the East, and unrecognized by the very nation he saved. But as the truth unfolded, historians realized that one man in one submarine had prevented the Cold War from turning into the final war, and that man's story had only just begun. When the B-59 incident finally ended and the submarine limped back to the Soviet Union, its exhausted crew disembarked into a world that had no idea what they had endured, no idea how close they had come to firing a nuclear torpedo, and no idea that history itself had been balanced on the decisions of starving, sweating, hallucinating men trapped underwater. Instead, they were met with suspicion, interrogations, and punishment because the Soviet Navy believed they had shamed their uniform by surfacing in front of American ships. And in the rigid paranoia of the USSR, even survival could be interpreted as failure. So the officers were reprimanded, the sailors were berated, and Arkhipav's act of planetary salvation was buried beneath layers of military secrecy, leaving him to return to his duties as if he had not prevented the extinction of millions. Meanwhile, the world moved forward with the illusion that the Cuban Missile Crisis had been resolved through calm diplomacy and strategic brilliance. As Kennedy and Khrushchev navigated the crisis through tense negotiations across an ocean of mistrust, but neither man ever realized that the crisis had slipped beyond their control on multiple occasions, that the world had nearly ended not in command rooms, but in deserts, jungles, oceans, and airspaces where individual soldiers made decisions far beyond the awareness of political leaders. Because at every level of the Cold War, miscommunication and fear created cracks that could have detonated global catastrophe. The truth began emerging in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and archives opened to historians hungry for answers about the world's closest brushes with nuclear war. And among the thousands of declassified documents, testimonies, and mission logs, the B-59 incident stood out not only for its danger, but for the sheer scale of ignorance surrounding it. American naval officers interviewed decades later admitted they had no idea the submarine carried a nuclear weapon, had no idea their signaling charges were being mistaken for attacks, and had no idea they had been moments away from provoking a nuclear launch that Washington would have interpreted as an act of Soviet aggression. And this ignorance was not due to negligence. but to the secrecy baked into Cold War military doctrines on both sides. The Americans believed they understood the Soviet mindset, but they didn't know that Soviet submarines were deployed with conflicting orders, insufficient intelligence, and weapons that required neither Moscow's authorization nor clear guidelines for use, because Soviet naval leaders had prepared their submarines not for controlled confrontation, but for desperate retaliation. Soviet submarine captains were told that if war broke out, communication with Moscow would likely be impossible. So they were expected to act autonomously, meaning each submarine was essentially a roaming, nuclear decision-maker. And this reality was far more terrifying than the world ever realized. The nuclear torpedo aboard B-59 had been intended as a last resort weapon, something to be used if the submarine was attacked and had no means of escape. But Soviet leaders failed to consider that submarines operating thousands of miles from home, surrounded by enemy ships, exhausted, overheated, and isolated, might misinterpret almost any threat as the beginning of a nuclear attack. In the decades that followed, Western analysts struggled to understand how the crisis had unfolded with such reckless proximity to nuclear war, and the answer they eventually uncovered was chilling. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were stumbling through the crisis blind, guided by incomplete data, miscommunication, and flawed assumptions, each believing the other was acting with perfect clarity when neither side had anything close to perfect information. American destroyer commanders believed their signaling charges were harmless. Soviet officers believed they were under attack. American political leaders believed Soviet submarines were operating far from the blockade line. The Soviet submarines were actually suffocating inside it. American intelligence believed Soviet submarines were diesel-electric vessels capable of long-term underwater endurance. The Foxtrot-class submarines could barely remain underwater for a few days without surfacing. American analysts believed Soviet submarines were well supplied. In reality, B-59's crew ran out of fresh water, food, and breathable air, their entire mission collapsing into a slow-motion nightmare. And perhaps most dangerously, both nations believed nuclear weapons were under strict central control, when in truth, tactical nuclear weapons in the early 1960s were scattered across submarines, aircraft, missile bases, and mobile units, often deployed with ambiguous or outdated rules of engagement, meaning the potential for unauthorized or accidental use was far greater than any official account admitted. Throughout the 1960s, nuclear weapons were treated with a mixture of reverence and casual acceptance, as if their existence was a natural part of geopolitical life. And this normalization blinded both superpowers to the fragility of their own safeguards. Many nuclear weapons in both the United States and the Soviet Union were held together with dangerously simplistic mechanisms, vulnerable to misfires, mechanical failure, or human error. Submarines like B-59 were equipped with tactical nuclear torpedoes, not because military leaders wanted widespread use, but because they feared the submarines had no other means of defending themselves if discovered. In other words, the weapon that nearly ended the world was placed on the submarine because Soviet leaders assumed the submarine would be hunted and destroyed. That assumption became a deadly self-fulfilling prophecy when the submarine was indeed hunted. But instead of defending itself, all-out nuclear war was nearly launched because of confusion inside a steel container drifting through water hotter than bathwater, filled with exhausted men whose judgment was decaying with every breath. The officers aboard B-59 later admitted they didn't know whether war had begun, only that they believed their lives were already effectively over, and in their desperation, they felt justified in striking back against what they assumed was the first wave of an American onslaught. That was the nightmare of Cold War nuclear doctrine. Decisions made under unbearable stress by men far from the eyes of political leaders. Decisions that could rip the world apart before a president or premier even understood what was happening. Arkipov's refusal became even more significant when historians discovered that several other Soviet submarines in the area had faced similar conditions during the crisis. B-75, B-4, and B-36 were all chased by American destroyers, forced to dive deeper than they could safely operate, enduring similar temperature extremes, oxygen depletion, and mounting psychological breakdown. Some submarines reported hallucinations among crew members. Others reported engines failing. One submarine nearly suffered a catastrophic battery explosion. American commanders operating under limited intelligence believed they were simply executing standard intercept procedures. Soviet commanders, isolated and overwhelmed, believed they were being forced into a war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, seen through this underwater lens, transformed from a political standoff into a chaotic collage of near-fatal miscommunications. And B-59 was merely the most catastrophic of these near misses. The horrifying truth is that the B-59 incident wasn't an anomaly. It was one example among dozens of Cold War moments where nuclear annihilation hinged on the judgment of a single human being. On land, radar technicians in both countries misinterpreted weather patterns, meteors, and technical glitches as incoming nuclear attacks. In the air, pilots drifted off course and triggered alerts that nearly escalated into retaliatory action. On missile bases, maintenance errors almost caused warheads to detonate. And underwater, submarines like B-59 carried nuclear weapons their crews barely understood. Deployed with vague orders and operating in environments so hostile that the line between caution and panic blurred into nothing. The 1962 crisis was not a duel between rational leaders. It was a tangled cluster of near disasters unfolding simultaneously, each one capable of igniting the final war. Arkipov's refusal was not just the act of a rational officer. It was a miracle of human restraint in a situation where almost any other man would have acted differently. By the late 1990s, when the incident finally became public, historians reevaluated the entire crisis, recognizing that the world's survival depended not on Kennedy's restraint or Khrushchev's negotiation, but on the quiet composure of a man inside a submarine. No one remembered Arkhipov became known as the man who saved the world, not because he made a bold speech or won a battle, but because he rejected a single catastrophic decision in a moment of unimaginable fear. His legacy revealed the darkest truth of the Cold War. Humanity survived not because its leaders were wise, but because its soldiers hesitated at the right moments. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that neither superpower learned the right lesson from the near disaster of B-59. The United States expanded its submarine fleet and nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union accelerated production of strategic weapons. Both sides built more warheads, more submarines, more delivery systems, and more procedures that relied on the judgment of officers under stress. The world did not step back from the edge after 1962. It walked right back toward it again and again throughout the Cold War. The B-59 incident was forgotten, buried under propaganda, secrecy, and the illusion that nuclear war was always prevented by rational actors. But history proved otherwise. Nuclear deterrence wasn't stable. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't safe. It was a chaotic, fragile system held together not by technology or doctrine, but by human choices made in darkness, heat, fear, and confusion. And in the case of B-59, the fate of the world was determined not by strategy or diplomacy, but by a single man's refusal to surrender to panic. In the years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the story of B-59 faded into obscurity, lost beneath layers of Soviet secrecy and American ignorance. But the submarine's near launch was not an isolated accident. It was part of a broader pattern of Cold War nuclear close calls, each one triggered by the same toxic mixture of fear, miscommunication, and technological fragility that almost doomed the world in 1962. And as the superpowers expanded their arsenals, the risks only multiplied. Both the United States and the Soviet Union built military systems that were catastrophically vulnerable to false alarms. Radar networks malfunctioned in storms. Satellites misread sunlight for missile launches. Computers glitched and interpreted training tapes as live nuclear attacks, and early warning crews were trained to respond within minutes, creating conditions where a single misinterpretation could ignite Armageddon. The logic of deterrence demanded instant readiness, but instant readiness created a world where one tired officer, one blip on a radar screen, or one miscommunication could erase cities before any leader understood what was happening. In this fragile environment, submarine crews like those aboard B-59 were often the weakest link, deployed in extreme conditions with minimal information, out of contact with their command structures, and given weapons capable of shattering the planet's submarines, were supposed to provide a stabilizing second strike capability to ensure neither side initiated war. But in practice, they became roving doomsday machines, isolated, stressed, and easily pushed into misreading signals as hostile acts. For the Soviet Union, these risks were magnified by inadequate funding, poor maintenance, and a culture of secrecy that prevented officers from admitting technical failures or requesting help, meaning submarines sometimes sailed with malfunctioning sensors, leaking pipes, broken ventilation systems, inaccurate maps, and incomplete intelligence. The Foxtrot-class submarines used during the 1962 crisis were notorious for their overheating, battery failures, and claustrophobic conditions. Yet the Soviet Navy continued deploying them into dangerous waters because they were the only long-range submarines available at the time. These vessels were not symbols of strength. They were floating death traps. And yet, the world depended on them functioning perfectly under impossible stress. As the Cold War progressed, both nations built new submarines armed with ballistic missiles, each vessel capable of launching dozens of nuclear warheads within minutes. But the nuclear torpedo aboard B-59 remained one of the most horrifying weapons ever deployed at sea because it placed apocalyptic power directly into the hands of local commanders who often operated blind. Soviet submarine officers interviewed decades later admitted they rarely received accurate intelligence, often relying on outdated maps, vague orders, and assumptions about enemy behavior. Many believed the Americans were more aggressive and unpredictable than they really were, creating a constant sense of imminent danger. In reality, American naval officers were often just as confused, unsure which Soviet submarines carried nuclear weapons, which were diesel-electric or nuclear-powered, and which were conducting reconnaissance versus combat patrols. The oceans became an arena of constant misinterpretation, where one ship's defensive maneuver looked like an attack to the other, and where every sonar ping could escalate into a deadly confrontation. Because both nations feared surprise attacks, they designed their submarine doctrines around secrecy and silence, which meant communication was almost non-existent during critical moments. Submarines often operated without knowing whether their country was at war, whether their fleet had been attacked, or whether their mission was still valid. This information gap was precisely what pushed Captain Savitsky toward nuclear launch aboard B-59. The submarine had no idea what was happening above, only that American ships were closing in, dropping charges and blocking escape routes. The Americans believed they were sending harmless signals. The Soviets believed they were under attack. This lethal ambiguity became a hallmark of underwater nuclear strategy. In the 1970s, toward the middle of the Cold War, both superpowers introduced new systems meant to reduce the risk of accidental war, but ironically, many of these systems increased the danger. Early warning radars became more complex, but also more prone to technical failure. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles became more powerful, but also more vulnerable to misinterpretation, and nuclear weapons multiplied, moving from aircraft and land bases to trains, mobile launchers, remote forests, and hidden missile silos. The sheer volume of weapons meant the probability of a catastrophic accident rose dramatically. In 1983, the Soviet Union experienced a false alarm so convincing that computers declared 5 American missiles were inbound toward Moscow, and only the calm judgment of Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov prevented a retaliatory strike. Petrov, like Arkhipov, refused to believe that the United States would launch only 5 missiles in a first strike. He waited. His hesitation prevented nuclear war, but his commanders punished him for deviating from protocol. The parallel between Petrov and Arkhipov became unmistakable. In both cases, humanity survived, because a Soviet officer refused to obey the system designed to protect the world. Throughout the 1980s, submarine confrontations continued, many of them classified, many of them far more dangerous than the public understood. American and Soviet submarines collided multiple times, sometimes deep underwater, where neither vessel could contact its fleet for clarification. In 1974, a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear missiles sank in the Pacific, sparking a secret CIA mission to retrieve the vessel before the Soviets could. In 1986, a Soviet nuclear submarine caught fire and nearly detonated its warheads. In 1983, an American submarine struck a Soviet vessel so hard it damaged its sonar systems and nearly triggered escalation. Each incident carried the potential for catastrophic misunderstanding, yet none of them were made public at the time. The illusion of perfect control persisted. The deeper historians looked into the Cold War's naval archives, the more the myth of rational nuclear deterrence fell apart. Submarine crews were not flawless machines of discipline. They were humans trapped in extreme environments, operating deadly weapons under near impossible conditions. Many submariners reported hallucinations during deep dives. Some suffered heat exhaustion. Others endured extreme dehydration. Several Soviet crews reported psychotic breaks among sailors trapped underwater for weeks. In one incident, a Soviet submarine officer attempted to shoot his captain. In another, a nuclear submarine had to abort its mission because the crew became violently ill from contaminated air. These incidents rarely reached Moscow. Commanders covered them up for fear of punishment. This culture of silence meant that dangerous patterns went uncorrected, leaving submarines vulnerable to the same types of breakdowns that had nearly ended the world in 1962. On the American side, the Navy also struggled with the psychological strain on its submarine crews, though conditions were generally safer and better resourced. Still, the U.S. experienced its own near disasters. In 1968, the USS Scorpion, a nuclear submarine carrying torpedoes, plutonium, and top-secret intelligence equipment, sank mysteriously in the Atlantic, killing all 99 men aboard. Its loss remains partially classified to this day. In 1982, the USS Baton Rouge collided with a Soviet submarine near the Arctic. In 1992, after the Cold War ended, the USS Augusta collided with a Russian submarine on patrol near Kola Bay. These collisions proved that neither side had complete control over its underwater arsenal, and each collision brought the world closer to a nuclear exchange triggered not by intent, but by accident. The most chilling realization from historians reviewing these incidents was simple. Global survival depended on luck far more than strategy. Nuclear strategy theorists imagined rational leaders making careful decisions based on clear information. They believed deterrence would prevent war because both sides understood the cost. But real history told a different story. Deterrence almost failed repeatedly because humans in submarines, radar stations, and missile bases made decisions under stress, fear, confusion, and incomplete data. If Arkhipov or Petrov had listened to protocol, the world would have burned. If one submarine officer misinterpreted sonar data, the world would have burned. If one radar technician trusted a false alarm, the world would have burned. The survival of humanity was never guaranteed. It was a miracle of hesitation. As the truth unfolded in the 2000s, Arkhipov's story gained recognition in the West. Documentaries were made, historians wrote books, awards were given posthumously, but in Russia, his role remained controversial. The modern Russian Navy acknowledged his heroism quietly, but the state avoided elevating him publicly because doing so would require admitting how catastrophically flawed Soviet command structures had been. Arkhipov's widow, Olga, recounted that he never thought of himself as a hero. He rarely spoke about the B-59. He carried himself with quiet humility, never once bragging that he had saved the world. He simply said he had done his duty, not the duty written in Soviet doctrine, but a deeper duty he felt as a human being responsible for the lives of millions. His story became a symbol of the terrifying truth behind the Cold War, that peace was maintained not by weapons or doctrines, but by the moral courage of a few individuals who refused to let fear determine their judgment. By the time the Cold War ended, both superpowers had built thousands of weapons capable of destroying humanity dozens of times over, and the oceans were filled with submarines carrying enough warheads to scorch the planet. Yet the closest humanity ever came to nuclear war wasn't a missile launch or a political standoff. It was a suffocating submarine filled with men who believed they were already dead, pushed by fear into considering a choice that would have erased cities, nations, and history itself. And if not for Vasili Arkhipov, the quiet officer who refused to be swallowed by panic, humanity's story would have ended in October 1962, swallowed by fire beneath the waves. The legacy of B-59 stretched far beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis, shaping the silent, paranoid decades that followed. Because even though the world never learned what had happened beneath the Atlantic, the Soviet Navy understood at least part of the truth. Their submarine fleet had come dangerously close to initiating a nuclear exchange, not through orders from Moscow, but through confusion, fear, and the unbearable conditions of submerged warfare. And this realization forced Soviet admirals to confront a terrifying reality. They had deployed frontline nuclear forces into the most chaotic environment possible, while failing to equip them with the communication, intelligence, or survival capabilities needed to avoid disaster. But instead of addressing the root causes, Soviet leadership focused on discipline, secrecy, and denial, punishing crews who surfaced under pressure, hiding equipment failures, and insisting that submarine commanders should withstand even the most hellish conditions without revealing themselves. Rather than accepting fault, the system blamed individuals. Archipov's refusal prevented nuclear war, yet he returned home to criticism, suspicion, and silence from his superiors. The Soviet Navy believed he had undermined protocol. They never realized he had saved their entire country. And so, as the Cold War moved forward, Soviet submarines continued operating under doctrines that assumed officers would make perfect decisions under impossible circumstances, while the American Navy, unaware of the near catastrophe, maintained its strategy of aggressive tracking, harassment, and signaling that could easily be misinterpreted as hostile action. The oceans became a minefield of accidental escalation, and for decades after the crisis, American destroyers continued dropping small practice charges near Soviet submarines, never knowing that these exact signals had nearly triggered Armageddon. By the mid-1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union attempted to modernize its submarine fleet, introducing nuclear-powered vessels capable of staying submerged for months. But nuclear propulsion brought new dangers: radiation leaks, reactor malfunctions, and catastrophic fires that threatened not only the crew but entire coastlines. Submarines like the K-19, which Arkhipov had survived before B-59, suffered repeated reactor problems and deadly accidents that killed dozens of sailors, while others sank silently into the depths, taking their nuclear warheads with them. One submarine, K-129, sank in 1968 in the Pacific under mysterious circumstances, prompting the United States to launch a top-secret recovery mission using a massive crane disguised as a mining ship. The Soviets, unaware of the truth, believed the Americans had attacked it. This suspicion fed directly into the escalating paranoia of the era. Every lost submarine, every broken antenna, every unexpected sonar contact risked becoming the spark for nuclear retaliation. Meanwhile, the Americans expanded their own submarine fleet, deploying Polaris and Poseidon missile subs beneath the oceans, each vessel carrying enough nuclear fire to burn continents. These submarines operated under strict control, but even the American systems were not perfect. Several subs experienced near collisions, mechanical failures, and accidental depth drops that could have been interpreted as hostile actions had they occurred near Soviet vessels. The world became a maze of underwater encounters, each one invisible to the public, each one capable of igniting the war Arkhipov had barely prevented. As nuclear arsenals grew, political leaders became increasingly disconnected from the realities of their own military systems. Presidents and premiers spoke confidently about deterrence, mutually assured destruction, and stable nuclear balance, unaware of how fragile their strategies were beneath the surface. They believed nuclear war would begin with intentional choices, formal orders, and carefully measured escalation, when in reality, the systems built on both sides created endless opportunities for accidents, misunderstandings, and individual misjudgments. Throughout the Cold War, dozens of incidents proved that political leaders were the last to know when danger struck. One radar failure in the United States triggered an alert that nearly led to the scrambling of nuclear bombers. A malfunctioning satellite in the Soviet Union falsely detected incoming American missiles. A U.S. missile test launched from California was briefly interpreted by Soviet censors as a potential first strike. The truth was that the Cold War was never controlled. It was a chaotic, unstable era in which nuclear weapons were deployed everywhere, on planes, in silos, on trains, on trucks, on submarines. And nearly all of these systems depended on human beings making perfect decisions under stress. And time after time, they didn't. The B-59 incident was the blueprint for this chaos, revealing that deterrence theory had failed the moment the submarine descended into heat, exhaustion, isolation, and fear. The significance of Arkipov's decision only became clear decades later, when historians realized that the Cuban Missile Crisis had been a multi-front disaster filled with unknown near misses. Most Americans believed the crisis ended because Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated wisely. Most Soviets believed the outcome was a diplomatic victory, but the truth that emerged from declassified documents showed that both leaders had lost control of their own militaries at multiple points. Khrushchev had no idea his submarine commanders were being depth-charged. Kennedy had no idea Soviet commanders in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons authorized for independent use. Soviet field officers in Cuba were prepared to launch nuclear missiles if U.S. forces invaded, and the Americans had no idea how close they came to triggering that order. At least 8 separate incidents during the crisis could have escalated into war, but B-59 was the most catastrophic because it combined isolation, heat exhaustion, panic, misinterpretation, and nuclear capability in one deadly environment. If Arkhipov had not refused, nuclear war would have begun not through ideology, not through strategy, not through political hatred, but through simple human confusion. By the time Arkipov's story began circulating in the late 1990s, he had already passed away, never fully recognized by his own nation for what he had done. Western historians hailed him as a hero, perhaps the greatest hero of the entire Cold War. Scientists studying nuclear risk called his refusal the single most important decision in human history. Military analysts admitted that deterrence theory could never explain why the crisis did not become a war. And diplomats acknowledged that no negotiation, treaty, or doctrine mattered as much as one man's willingness to say no in a moment of fear. Yet even as Arkipov's story spread, the larger truth remained horrifying. For decades, the world survived because a few individuals hesitated at the right moments. There was no safety net, no technological guarantee, no political oversight, just humans caught in systems too large and too dangerous for anyone to fully control. The Cold War eventually ended in 1991, but the submarines remained, the nuclear weapons remained, and the same dynamics of miscommunication and technical failure continued into the modern era. Russian submarines still patrol beneath the Arctic ice. American ballistic missile subs still roam the Pacific and Atlantic. China has begun deploying its own nuclear submarines. The oceans remain filled with vessels capable of ending civilization within minutes. And the lesson of B-59 remains as urgent today as it was in 1962. Nuclear war has always been most likely to start not with political decisions, but with accidents, misunderstandings, and human beings pushed past their limits. As historians look back on the Cold War, one conclusion becomes impossible to ignore. Humanity survived not because of deterrence, but in spite of it. Arkhipov didn't follow doctrine. He didn't rely on strategy. He didn't obey protocol. He listened to instinct, reason, and human responsibility in a moment where everything around him demanded panic. Without him, the ocean would have erupted in nuclear fire. Without him, Washington and Moscow would have burned. Without him, the world as we know it would not exist. And that terrifying truth remains the silent heartbeat beneath Cold War history. The survival of humanity once depended not on nations, weapons, or governments, but on the calm refusal of one man trapped in a sinking submarine beneath the crushing weight of the Atlantic darkness. In the final analysis of the B-59 incident, when historians, intelligence analysts, and military experts attempted to quantify how close humanity came to nuclear annihilation, they reached a chilling consensus. The world did not merely brush against catastrophe, it hung suspended over the abyss, held back only by a few fragile human decisions made by men who had no idea of the consequences their choices carried. And this reality forced a painful reevaluation of everything the world believed about Cold War stability. The myth of rational superpowers, each carefully avoiding escalation, dissolved under the weight of evidence showing that leaders were often the last to know what was happening at the front lines. Both the United States and the Soviet Union built vast nuclear infrastructures, believing their systems were controlled, predictable, and governed by clear protocols. But the submarine incident revealed the opposite. Nuclear war was most likely to begin through confusion, exhaustion, faulty intelligence, and systems too complex for anyone to fully control. Arkhipov, trapped in a suffocating submarine, was not following doctrine. He was resisting it, guided instead by a moral clarity that Soviet military culture rarely rewarded. His refusal was an act of bravery so monumental that its impact is impossible to measure. Because it prevented a war that would have erased measurement itself, the world that emerged after the Cuban Missile Crisis was shaped in ways no leader understood. Kennedy believed he had stood firm and forced the Soviets to back down. Khrushchev believed he had preserved Soviet security while avoiding nuclear conflict. Castro believed the Soviet Union had failed him. The American public believed the deterrence had worked, but all of them believed these things without ever knowing that the greatest gamble of the crisis had taken place in a submarine so hot its walls dripped with human sweat. As nuclear weapons spread throughout the world in the decades that followed, the lessons of B-59 lingered quietly beneath the surface. India and Pakistan built their own arsenals, each vulnerable to misinterpretation and panic. China developed ballistic missile submarines with crew rotations and training patterns eerily similar to early Soviet practices. North Korea built its first nuclear devices with secrecy and rigid command structures that mirrored the Soviet military's most dangerous tendencies. And through it all, the global public remained unaware that the greatest nuclear threat had always come from misunderstood signals and human desperation, not deliberate aggression. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States assumed nuclear danger had diminished, but instead it simply shifted. Russian submarines fell into disrepair. Loose weapons and rogue officers became a new threat. Missile detection systems underwent chaotic restructuring. In the 1990s, overworked Russian radar crews mistook a Norwegian weather rocket for a possible American launch, prompting President Yeltsin to activate the nuclear briefcase, the only time in history a leader has done so in response to a real-time alert. What prevented retaliation? The same force that saved the world in 1962. Hesitation. The acknowledgement that something didn't feel right. The willingness to wait. These parallels made it clear that nuclear stability had never been a product of perfect systems. It had always depended on imperfect humans acting rationally under irrational conditions. The ocean, the silent stage of the B-59 incident, remained one of the most dangerous nuclear arenas long after the Cold War ended. Russia continued to rely heavily on submarine-based deterrence, launching massive Bory-class vessels armed with some of the world's most powerful nuclear missiles. The United States maintained its Ohio-class submarines, each capable of obliterating dozens of cities within minutes. China deployed Jin-class submarines. The United Kingdom and France maintained their own fleets. Every one of these submarines operated under doctrines shaped by Cold War assumptions. Assumptions that deterrence was stable, that communication would be available, and that officers would make perfect decisions under pressure. Yet every one of these assumptions had been shattered by the B-59 incident. If the crisis taught anything, It was that submarine crews are often isolated, confused, and forced to act with incomplete information. The conditions that pushed Savitsky toward nuclear launch, a lack of communication, environmental stress, misinterpreted signals, and fear, still exist today. Modern submarines may be quieter, cooler, and more advanced, but human psychology has not changed. Panic, exhaustion, pride, and fear still influence decisions in ways technology cannot prevent. The weapons are stronger, the communications are better, but the world remains vulnerable to the same cracks that nearly split history in two in October 1962. Arkipov's legacy eventually gained recognition in the West, but in Russia he remained a quiet, largely unknown figure. His family recalled that he rarely spoke of the crisis, never sought attention, and never viewed himself as a hero, saying only that he had done what he believed was right. When Western historians finally told his story to global audiences, he became known as the man who saved the world, a title he never asked for, but undeniably deserved. Schools taught his story. Documentaries featured his decision. Scientists studying existential risk used him as a case study in the power of individual moral choice. And yet, the world still struggles to internalize the true lesson of his actions. Nuclear weapons are not controlled by machines or doctrines. They are controlled by people, and people are fragile. They sweat, they fear, they misunderstand, they suffer, they break, and they hesitate. History is often shaped not by clear orders, but by moments of doubt. And in the case of B-59, doubt was the only thing that prevented the apocalypse. The full truth about B-59 did not reach the public until the early 2000s, when declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and newly uncovered recordings made it clear that humanity had survived the Cuban Missile Crisis by a margin far thinner than previously believed. The world learned that nuclear war had been seconds away. It learned that the underwater confrontation was not part of the official diplomatic narrative. It learned that soldiers and sailors, not presidents and premiers, bore the greatest burden of preventing escalation. And it learned that accidental nuclear war was not a theoretical possibility. It had already almost happened. As this knowledge spread, experts began re-evaluating nuclear strategy from the ground up. What they found was horrifying. The systems built to maintain peace were filled with single points of failure. Critical decisions depended on people with incomplete information. False alarms were common. Misunderstandings were expected. And nuclear weapons designed to deter conflict often created the very conditions that could spark it. The B-59 incident was a perfect storm of these failures. Bad equipment, bad intelligence, bad communication, overwhelming stress, and weapons that required no permission from Moscow to fire. Arkhipov had saved the world not because the system worked, but because the system had nearly killed everyone. And this is why the story of B-59 is not just a Cold War anecdote, but one of the most important events in human history, because it reveals the truth behind nuclear deterrence. It was never safe. It was never stable. It was never rational. It was a dangerous illusion built on weapons too powerful, systems too fragile, and humans too vulnerable to error. The world survived the Cold War because of a handful of people who refused to act on fear. Arkhipov was one of them. Petrov was another. Yeltsin was another. Each time, humanity survived because someone resisted panic, someone doubted, someone paused. But pauses cannot be counted on as strategy. The next time a misunderstanding occurs, whether underwater, in space, in cyberspace, or in a radar bunker, the world may not have an Arkhipov to stop it. The stakes are too high for survival to depend on luck or heroism. And yet, that is exactly how humanity survived the Cold War. By accident, by hesitation, by the courage of one man in a submarine nobody remembered. The lesson of B-59 is as urgent now as it was then. Nuclear war does not require evil intent. It requires only confusion, only panic, only misinterpretation, only fear, one depth charge, one false alarm, one overheated submarine, one human too exhausted to think clearly, and one decision without a hero to stop it. Arkhipov was that hero once. The world cannot rely on another. And so the legacy of B-59 is not only a story of a man who saved the world, it is a warning from the depths of history that the line between peace and annihilation is always far thinner than we want to believe. And that civilization survives not because it is strong, but because at least once a single human being refused to let fear shape the fate of the world.